following program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Welcome to About Money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments, surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared on the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
And it's 11 a.m. and we're talking about money. 2 hours of About Money. So last week, there were technical difficulties. We recorded the program, but we weren't able to broadcast it. We're going to be broadcasting last week's program this week at 12 noon, so don't go away. We've got a couple hours to bring you more information. It's going to be a good day. So that's coming at noon, the program, and we've got today's program. Now, if you've been listening to the program for very long, you know that I like baseball. I've been a stockbroker, financial advisor for 33 years, and for 33 years I've had Mariner season tickets. And I want to talk a little bit about baseball today. May 6, 1982, Gaylord Perry, who became the 15th pitcher to win 300 games, only 14 others had done it before Gaylord Perry. But he was with the Seattle Mariners at the end of his career. He won his 300th game on May 6th, 1982. May 6th, 1982. Gaylord Perry won his 300th game, and he did it for the Seattle Mariners. And I was invited on May 6th, 2017 to meet Gaylord Perry because he was here to celebrate 35 years from winning his 300th game. There were half a dozen of us that met with him, and I actually had the chance to talk to him. I asked him, I said, is the rumor really true that you used to put Vaseline on your hands and go shake hands with the players in the visitors' dugout? And he said, well, sure. He said, they had chapped hands. So he had a reputation of throwing a spitball, of doctoring things so that he got a better grip on the ball. He said, actually, that if he hadn't been able to do that, he'd probably not been able to win 300 games. But that brought to mind a story that I read not too long ago when he played most of his career for the San Francisco Giants. And his manager back in 1961 to 1964 was a guy by the name of Alvin Dark. Those 61 to 64, those were the days of Willie Mays, Willie McCovey. I think Orlando Cepeda came in 65, but Juan Marichal was the pitcher. The Alou brothers were part of the San Francisco Giants at that time. It was a big time. It was the Dodgers and the Giants who were always competing to make the World Series. And there was a National League. There was no designated hitters. So the pitchers would hit. And in those days, it was in both the American League and the National League. But today it's just in the National League where there's no designated hitter. And Gaylord Perry was a pitcher who hit 131. Now that's not a very good average. And it seems that during that time when Alvin Dark was the manager, that they were taking batting practice. And Gaylord Perry was up taking batting practice and hitting the ball. And Alvin Dark kept saying he has a terrible swing. It's just not there. And the other players were saying that it was flawed, that he just didn't have the snap of the bat where the ball would leave the park. And Alvin Dark made the comment, there will be a man walking on the moon before Gaylord Perry hits a home run. That was his comment. So fast forward to July 20th, 1969, just 50 years ago. And do you know what was going on during that day? That was the day of the lunar landing. Americans were really riveted to the TV. I remember watching that whole thing happen. Just watching that incredible event. We'd never been to the moon. And here we were. Apollo 11 was up in space and the lunar module was setting down. And that same day, the San Francisco Giants were playing the LA Dodgers. They were at Candlestick Park. And Matty Schwab, who was the groundskeeper at the park, had set up a black and white TV, and he set it up in his work area. And that work area was under the grandstands in right field. And most of the giant relievers would switch between watching some of the game and going in and watching the lunar lander. They were like most Americans. Now, there were 32,560 fans at Candlestick Park, and they suddenly erupted into an explosion of, the relief pitchers out in the bullpen. They thought that man had finally landed on the moon. That was a big thing. Actually, the game had begun at 1 o'clock, and at 1:17 is when the lunar module set down on the moon. And the announcer at the ballpark announced that the man had landed on the moon, a moment of silence. But in the third inning, there was suddenly an eruption, and some people thought that man had finally gotten out of the lunar module and walked on the moon. Well, that wasn't what the eruption was about. The eruption was Gaylord Perry hit a home run. His first in his career. He launched the ball out of the park. Now, the fact is that the game had begun at 1 o'clock. It was the third inning. Claude Osteen of the Dodgers had grooved a fastball to Perry that he launched out of the park. And it wouldn't be until 7:56 that evening that Neil Armstrong would actually set foot on the moon. Gaylord Perry had hit a home run before man walked on the moon. A couple hours before. Alvin Dark was wrong. Pierre Wack, quoted in The Economist this past week, talks about gurus. Peter Wack was a guru quoted in The Economist this week. He was a guru who was into scenario planning for Shell Oil. Dealing with the future is like shooting rapids in a boat. That's what Wack said. Knowing the general direction of travel, but not the exact path. The trick is to be able to respond quickly, and dealing with future change is a perception of the present. It affects the perception of the present. It helps you understand what is around the corner. Now, Gaylord Perry and the walking on the moon, those weren't connected in any way. It's a fun story, but it's not really connected to predictions. Knowing that man might walk on the moon one day had nothing to do with Gaylord Perry hitting a home run. It was a random event. And yet, a lot of things that are random events draw the attention of financial advisors and gurus in the market. And for financial advisors, it's all about looking toward the future to achieve the goals, because client goals are in the future. And you have to have some idea of the scenario and the scene where we're going. The best way to do is to map out the future scenarios, and I don't believe it's all that difficult. If you look at where we're going today, there's really essentially three possibilities, three scenarios. We can continue like we have been since 2009, this very strong market, this very strong growth. And if you've been listening to the program long, you know that I think that this study done by Standard Chartered Bank of the UK is very valid. And that predicts we're going to have worldwide GDP growth continuing at a better than average rate for another 10 years. So we could see this continue for another 10 years. And I hope it will be. A second scenario is that we continue for a while and then we hit another great recession. There's almost no question that we're going to have a recession. How big that recession is, who knows? But it's possible we could have another great recession. Or the third scenario is that we experience a great inflation. And if you've been listening to the program, you know that I assigned that a 85% probability. 85, it's a lot. Now there's There's other scenarios. I don't think there's very much. And I think if you examine the three of those, you can get through and you can paint a scenario. And thinking about each one of those possibilities gives you a roadmap of what to do and what to do. A plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. And maybe all three plans have essentially the same way to get there. Now, the purpose of this program is to put you ahead of the curve, to prepare for you for what might be coming. And while financial planning, which is done by almost most financial advisors, it's very good at the first alternative. If everything continues the way it is, it's based on averages. And if we continue like we are, in that first scenario, financial planning will get you to where you want to be. And yeah, they have Monte Carlo simulation, but it's only if the historical averages are right. But financial planning doesn't do anything for the Great Recession or inflation. And we've talked about how to prepare. Today, I want to talk about something different. And we are coming up to a commercial break. So that's something different I want to talk about is coming after the commercial break. Don't go away. We've got a lot to cover. We're going to talk about some of the other things going on. I've talked about what happens if we have a Great Recession or inflation. Now I want to talk about something else going forward. So don't go away. We'll be right back after this commercial break. And do stay with us because we've got a lot more to do in these 2 hours. I'll be right back.
More about money coming up with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I'm back. I talked in the first part of the program about looking into the future. It's a time that you have to prepare and look forward to it. I've been talking about that with the super cycle. I repeat that super cycle program about every 3 months just to keep it in mind because it is the mile-high view of what's going on in the world. We're seeing a worldwide growth happening. And that's where we are. It could continue until 2030. Could continue for such a long time. It makes people forget there's a possible ending to this whole thing. And yet, in all likelihood, we know that there will be an ending. And what happens in that end time? When the market, and it's not an end time like Armageddon, but it's an ending to the stock market time. We've seen that time and time and time again. Things get out of hand and things come crashing down. I think we still got a lot of time, and I think there's time to prepare for the other alternatives, to prepare for the Great Recession, to prepare for the Great Inflation, if those happen to be how this secular bull market ends. And I think that it will end probably in a great inflation period of time. But right now, it's time to look at how things are continuing to run. And I believe they are going to run. But I am not while I am optimistic and while I believe things are going forward, there are a lot of negative people here. Negativity, by the way, sells a lot. There are people that will publish articles that are intended to draw in customers, to draw in clients, because negativity sells. And there's a number of prognosticators who say that technology has come to an end. Robert Gordon is probably the best known at Northwestern University, and I've talked about him a number of times. I call him the new Malthus. Malthus was the English economist who in the late 1600s or late 1700s, 1800s predicted that we had reached a peak for agricultural productivity and food prices were going to rise, and it was better to have people die than to have the population continue to expand. That was Malthus. Robert Gordon has written a book. He talks a lot about 3 technological cycles that we've gone through. Why do people talk about 3s, the 3 super cycles, the 3 technical cycles? I don't know. 3 cycles. He said the first cycle was from 1750 to 1830. It was a cycle when you had the steam engine, cotton spinning, and the railroads. Cotton was a huge production from the U.S. 80% or 85% of our exports in the mid-1800s were cotton to Europe. The first Great Depression we had in the 1830s to 1840s happened because cotton prices took a big drop and cotton demand took a big drop. Cotton was a huge export. And cotton spinning was one of the things that allowed us not just to grow a lot more cotton, but to put it into use. And the steam engine allowed an increased productivity from moving transportation. And of course, railroads fit that category. 1750 to 1830, that's a period of 80 years in which those affected. From 1870 to 1900, the invention of, or the understanding of electricity, of the internal combustion, of running water. And running water is probably the most important of all three, because running water allowed us to live longer, allowed things to happen that had happened before. Electricity, we had alternating current, and we're going to come back and talk about that a little later. The internal combustion engine, in that time, as we turned to the turn of century, in the 1890s to 1900, one of the biggest problems facing cities, and people were moving into the cities, but one of the biggest problems in the cities was transportation, because what was transportation? It was the horse. And what did horses leave behind? Piles of manure and urine. The streets were covered. New York City had piles of manure that were 40 to 60 feet high. But that wasn't the only city. All around the world, there were congresses that were convened to discuss the problem of what to do about piles of manure. Those problems all went away with the internal combustion engine. And not only did those problems go away, but it allowed transportation to move things much quicker and much further. So from 1870 to 1900 was a very significant time of technological change. And of course, Gordon says the third time was 1960 to 1990s with the advent of the computer. You are familiar with a computer and all things. And he said that since the late 1990s, innovation has slowed down. We're entering a time of slow innovation and slow productivity and slow growth. That's what Gordon says. Negativity sells. And he says we're reaching a period of time when things are not going to be moving very fast. So in contrast to that, there was a paper that was done by Eric this is a long name for me to pronounce, Brynjolfsson, Daniel Rock of MIT, Chad Syverson of the University of Chicago. And they say that technological breakthroughs take decades to impact economic growth. Some of it is due to false starts with the technology. Some is due to costly implementation. Some is due to human resistance. And some is simply math. Think about it. Think about that last point, simple math. It takes years for an invention or technology to have an impact when the global economy is $80 trillion. So for a technology to have an impact, it takes decades sometimes. And they go back and they look at what happened. They use the example of electric motors. When electric motors came out using alternating current, they were introduced in the late 1800s by Thomas Edison and Westinghouse. There was a big controversy over the two. Tesla happened at that time, and Tesla was proposing alternating current. Both Westinghouse and Edison were fighting over who would produce the electric alternating current motors and lighting. Big story. that was the late 1800s. But by 1919, 30 years later, by 1919, not even half of U.S. factories had electricity. They hadn't been electrified. 30 years after the use of alternating current electric motors, less than half. You know, when you think about that time, that's during the first supercycle. 1870 to 1913, it was driven by the industrialization of the U.S., but less than half of the factories had moved toward electrification. Took a long time. Integrated circuits came out in the 1960s. Integrated circuits, those are the circuit boards in computers, in toasters, in whatever. By the mid-1980s, over 20 years later, fewer than 5% of the value of business equipment included integrated circuits. That came toward the end of the second supercycle, 1945 to 1970, which was driven primarily by the industrialization of the UK, or driven primarily by the rebuilding of Europe, by the decolonization. And yet, during that period of time was also the period of time when you saw integrated circuits begin to make an impact. And of course, the integrated circuits was key to the computer. I can remember in 1986, when I got my first business computer, when I was working as a financial advisor, stockbroker, there were 3 programs I had. I had Word, I had Excel, I had a database, Ashton Tate. That was the mid-'80s, and I thought, okay, I have all the software I will ever need. I had a computer with 100 megabytes of memory. I thought I was never, ever going to purchase a computer again because I had all the memory that I could ever need. Dead wrong. It took decades for that to mature. It was into the time of the internet. The internet didn't appear until the early 1990s, and we even went through the dot-com drop. It was a decade for the internet to have an impact, and it's had a huge impact on retail, on transportation, on travel. It's had a huge impact, but it took decades. You needed to build out the infrastructure to compute it, to accommodate computers and all those things that take decades to build out. And the same thing is beginning to happen with industries like alternative energy. It's only 2% of the world's energy consumption is coming from alternative energy. It's a huge, huge part of global economics. $8 to $9 trillion of an $80 trillion economy is energy. Think about it. Media, radio, books, TV, movies, everything to do with media is less than $1 trillion. Energy, 8 to 9 trillion. You know, energy consumption is growing. Renewable energies is just at the very beginning, which, you know, things take a time to happen and develop, and you have to build the infrastructure. And we're just beginning to do that. Those things are coming, and we don't even see the real impact of those. No more than we saw the impact really of computers in 1960s. No more than we saw the impact of electric motors in 1900. That's what's happening. Don't go away. I'll be coming right back. We've got a lot more to cover, and we've got another hour and a half to hear this program. Don't go away. I'll be right back.
More about money coming up with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So as I finished the last little bit of the last segment, I was talking about alternative energy. 2% of the world's energy consumption is coming from renewable energy, from alternative energy sources. So it's a very small part, and yet it's a huge, huge part of the world economy. $8 to $9 trillion out of an $80 trillion economy. And it's the largest portion of the economy. And that brings me to my guest today. She's been on the radio before, and I wrote an e-letter a while back, a few months ago, talking about fracking and renewables, wind and solar being furnishing part of the energy, and the rest of the energy being produced by natural gas. And she contacted me and she said I'm wrong. And she corrected me. So we will hear about that more. We're first going to hear about her background. We're going to hear about her companies. And then she's going to tell you why I was wrong. And we'll get to that later in the program. But I will introduce now Susan Petty, who is the President and Chief Technology Officer of AltRock and Circ Energy. So welcome to the program, Susan.
Thank you, Mike.
So let's start with your background.
Yes, so I am a hybrid. I have a geology bachelor's degree from Princeton University. I was in the first class that had women. And I also have a civil engineering degree in groundwater hydrology from the University of Hawaii. And that's where I got into geothermal energy.
Okay. So let's talk about AltRock. That's where you were when we did the radio program a long time ago.
That's right. So I founded AltRock Energy back in 2007. I started the company to concentrate on emerging technology for geothermal energy, to use some of the techniques we thought that had been developed for oil and gas hydraulic fracturing to improve. They were developed originally to improve the output of very tight oil and gas reservoirs to produce more oil and gas out of those unconventional resources. We wanted to use those same kind of techniques for geothermal to produce geothermal energy out of unconventional geothermal resources that were very tight, very hard rock that was also very hot.
So tell us how you do that.
All right. So basically, we originally thought we would use those same methods that are used in oil and gas, which is to isolate a zone in the rock to create a fracture. And we thought that would be a single fracture, and then we would move on and create another single fracture like the oil and gas people do. Now, in oil and gas, they have layered sedimentary rocks, and that may not mean something to most people, but I mean, just the concept is that the oil and gas reservoir is a deposit that was laid down in a flat layer back, millions of years ago. And it had a lot of organic material in it that got squished, and oil and gas formed out of that organic material.
I used the example once of lasagna.
Yeah.
It's like noodles stacked one on top of the other.
That's right. And those layers are oftentimes go on for many, many thousands of feet. And the oil and gas people developed methods to follow those layers underground for long distances with their wells. Tens of thousands of feet these wells can be, and they can make a right angle turn to follow those flat layers for a long distance. And that can then give them a lot of contact with that organic rich layer that has the oil and gas in it, but is so tight that it won't flow out freely. And then they use mechanical devices to isolate and make a fracture, lots of single fractures in those zones. Now, that works great for them. They're trying to get something very different out of the rock than we're trying to get in geothermal. So in geothermal, most of the rocks we're dealing with are brittle, hard rocks from volcanic or what we call metamorphic sources. So that lasagna got squished and heated so that it turned into a solid brick rather than a nice squishy layer of cheese and noodles. So we in the geothermal business wanted to get the heat out of that kind of rock, and we found that the methods that were used for oil and gas just didn't work well for us. Those single fractures didn't provide enough access to the hot rock. We couldn't get the heat out effectively. And so we developed at Alterock, our focus was to develop alternative methods, things that would work better for our kind of rock, our kind of energy source that we were trying to use. And we developed a suite of methods that allow you to make a complex network of small fractures. We didn't need to turn 90 degrees or drill horizontal wells or any of that stuff. We didn't need to use the high pressures that the oil and gas folk use to make their cracks in the rock. And so we developed these methods around what we call hydroshearing, takes lower pressures. It relies a lot on the contrast between the cold water you're injecting and hot rock rather than on high pressures. So we successfully did that at Alterock. We bought 3 projects to demonstrate our technology at. We successfully fractured wells at one of those projects and turned it around and turned it into a money-making deal, which we then sold last year to a company called Circ Energy, which had 4 other geothermal power plants that they operated, and this became one of their suite of power plants. So they then hired me. Part of my time is now dedicated to their projects and trying to make them produce the best they can.
So when you talk about the hard rock, is it special to certain areas?
Well, it is if you want to go to shallow depths, right? So we only find high temperatures at shallow depths in certain places. And but there's lots of those certain kind of places, particularly in the Western U.S. Now, if we want to do that outside of the Western U.S., in other words, east of the Rocky Mountains, essentially, we have to go to deeper depths to find that heat. And when we get down there, again, we find those same kind of brittle, hard rocks that we're used to dealing with in the West. So in the West, we can find plenty of energy. In fact, the U.S. Geological Survey did a study a while back and looked at how much energy could you recover using geothermal energy techniques in the Western U.S. And they found that in the 9 Western states, you could probably produce economically about 500,000 megawatts, which is a lot. I like to use the unit of a Hoover Dam. One Hoover Dam is about an average about 1,000 megawatts. And so that's 500 Hoover Dams. Think about that.
Wow, that's huge. And it's a repeatable source.
That's right. So once we figure out how to do this, once we get into the hot rock, we've developed a template for how do we get that heat out? How do we make electricity out of it? And that was what the focus of Alterock was getting that heat out so that it could be used to make electricity.
So now, once you get the heat out, how do you convert it to electricity then?
Oh, that's really interesting. So there's basically 2 major ways. For hotter resources above about 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 200 degrees centigrade, we use steam turbines, just like a steam turbine that you would have from a coal-fired power plant or for a nuclear plant or for a natural gas plant that burned natural gas and boiled water. So these are called thermal plants. And the only difference between a thermal plant that uses a fossil fuel source or something else to heat the water and boil it, we let the work be done by the rocks down in the ground. So we just drill wells to where it's hot, and we take out that steam and hot water, or just steam. We separate the hot water, put it back in the ground, and we take the steam and we run it through a steam turbine. Now, the only difference is that our steam turbines are significantly lower pressure and lower temperature mostly than a steam turbine for a coal plant. So in the case of lower temperatures, though, we have a really cool thing that we do. We take that hot water out of the ground. The hot water goes through a heat exchanger. It boils a fluid, another fluid, that boils at a lower temperature, higher pressure than water. And we take that vapor and put it through a turbine that uses that kind of vapor, turns a generator and makes electricity. Then all that cooled off geothermal water goes back in the ground.
So you're recycling the water
Yes.
through the whole thing.
Yeah, so we're not using water. We don't consume water in our process. We just consume heat. So our goal is to take that water out, take the heat out of it, and put it back in the ground to it can flow through the cracks in the rock and pick up the heat again and come out hot and use it over and over again. So it goes around and around. It's basically a closed loop subsurface.
That's awesome. And a huge amount of potential out of
Huge.
geothermal energy, which in the past, geothermal energy has to be a natural source.
That's
This is
right.
something, a technology that allows you to extract the heat from many different places.
That's right. One of the things we're looking at now is to go to places where we find really high temperatures at relatively shallow depths so that we can get better efficiency. And that's, I think, the next big thing that I think we're looking at.
So we're coming to a commercial break. We'll be back with Susan right after this commercial break because she still has to tell you what I got wrong. We'll come back to that. Don't go away. And if you miss part of this program or part of the other programs, you can find it on YouTube.
More about money coming up with Mike Adams on AM 1590 The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I'm here with Susan Petty of Alta Rock and Circ Energy. And I do want to talk about what I got wrong. I sent out a letter. I did some programs on using alternative energy like solar and wind and filling in the gap with natural gas. I got it wrong. So Susan, tell us how I got it wrong.
So there were basically two things that I saw in Mike's letter that bothered me. And one is the idea that by filling in the gaps between those intermittent resource sources, solar and wind, which only, as we know, happen when the sun shines or the wind blows, with natural gas, is that Mike felt that this would be a bridge to lower emissions. The problem is that the power plants we use to generate electricity for that filling the gap use natural gas very inefficiently. The natural gas is a wonderful resource, but it has lower BTUs per unit than coal. So if we say burn it to boil water to make steam like you do in a coal plant, and a lot of coal plants are getting converted to natural gas these days, we actually have to use more natural gas than we would coal because coal is a more dense energy resource. So it's less efficient. And the other problem with this whole thing with saying natural gas is going to be this bridge to a lower CO2 future is that natural gas comes with a component, methane, that is a much more intense greenhouse gas than CO2. And the problem with methane is that every natural gas well, every natural gas pipeline, every natural gas facility, and the natural gas storage facilities that we have for subsurface storage of natural gas, they all leak, and they all leak methane. And that methane gets into the atmosphere. I don't know if you've ever heard of Aviso Canyon. Aviso Canyon is a natural gas storage facility. It was found that the wells at Aviso Canyon were leaking. They were leaking really badly. Nobody detected it. The neighbors were complaining because they were having side effects of breathing too much methane. Until finally one day, the leak got so bad that there was no ignoring it anymore. And that was really, really a dangerous situation because methane's flammable. So if it gets in high enough concentrations and catches fire, you really have a problem. Plus, it's toxic. So we don't want to be breathing it. And the result was that they had to shut down the Aliso Canyon gas storage facility and fix it. And that meant abandoning a bunch of the wells that were leaking. It meant putting in much better leak detection facilities. So This kind of thing is one of the issues with natural gas. But every single natural gas facility that we have, all the pipelines, all of the processing facilities, all the storage facilities, they all leak this methane. And so that's another side of this that we really want to look at if we're thinking about a low carbon, greenhouse gas future. So that was one of the things I saw. The other thing that you said that really did bother me, because I've been involved with this for a really long time, more than 40 years now, is that these were new methods, the fracturing and so forth, the fracking that we hear about so much, that this was newly developed to get this natural gas out of the ground. The thing is, we developed these methods back in the 70s and early 80s. We just didn't start using them until the price of natural gas got high enough to make them profitable, to make it profitable to go after these unconventional, low permeability, crummy gas reservoirs and use fracking. So it's an old technology. It's been around forever. And we've obviously got much better at it now.
Well, thank you for correcting me. I mean, as you look into the future and try to imagine where to go with investments, you have to examine a lot of these things. So hearing about where I'm wrong always is a big help. It avoids making a mistake.
So one of the things about investing in energy, the energy future, is you have to look at where is the growth. And right now, the growth is in solar.
It is.
PV, and we are putting in solar facilities left, right, and center. But that's got a limit because we can only get energy out of solar when the sun shines. And there are parts of the world and the country where we don't get a whole lot of sunshine in the winter. So, and we need more energy in the winter in those parts of the country because those are the cold parts of the country. So the further north you go, there's lots of sun in the summertime, more sun than, further south. But in the wintertime, there is hardly any solar energy at all. In fact, our solar facilities that are up in Alaska, say, can go to almost zero in the wintertime. And that's when we have high demand. So we need to be looking at, as far as an investment is concerned, how can we meet the demand for energy with these intermittent resources, still take advantage of them? The cost has come down so dramatically. And plus which there are good tax incentives for putting those in and makes them a good investment. But we need to be looking to the next thing, and the next thing is adding storage to those kinds of intermittent resources so we can meet demand. Now, everybody knows about batteries, and we know that batteries can work well with wind and solar, but when you start looking at the nitty-gritty of adding battery storage to wind and solar, we find that batteries can only provide a short-term bump of output without going to really, really large installations. So if I have 10 megawatts of solar and I want to have 10 megawatts that covers the time of day when I have the highest demand, I need to generate 4 to 6 hours of 10 megawatts at the times when the sun is just not available.
Yeah.
Early in the morning and in the evening. So how am I going to do that? And with batteries right now, I would need 4 or even 6 times that 10 megawatts of battery storage. And so you'll see people saying, oh yeah, really great and wonderful, low cost for batteries plus solar. But unfortunately, that battery is only covering a tiny fraction of the needed extra energy to cover high demand periods. And in the middle of the day, I'm beginning to have excess solar that I don't know what to do with it in places where there's really high solar input.
You're right.
So one of the things that we've been looking at is how can we store energy longer term? So we call this long duration storage. And one of the things that CERC is looking at is storing that energy as heat. Now, he first thought, well, we have a geothermal reservoir. Let's put extra heat in there and store it as heat and take it out later. Unfortunately, we haven't figured out how to control the subsurface well enough to be able to do that. So too much of the energy would go away and dissipate into the rock, and we wouldn't be able to recover it. So we said, well, we still like rocks. Let's look at storing heat in artificial rocks with insulated containers in boxes at the surface that we can control everything about it. We'll heat it up with electricity from solar at high output periods, and then get it back as high heat to boost our geothermal output the rest of the time.
So that is coming, and we will do another radio program in the not too distant future and talk more about that. Okay, so Susan, closing out, give us your contact information. How would somebody get a hold of you? Give us your information.
So you can go to Altarock's website and see what we're doing. That's altarockenergy.com, ALTAROCK energy.com. And you can reach me at spetty, SPETTY, at altarockenergy.com.
So thank you for being on the program. Great information.
Thank you, Mike.
Don't go away, because we have another hour of this program coming up.
You've been listening to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you'd like Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared in the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Saturday at noon for more About Money with Mike Adams here on AM 1590.